title of this seminar is How to Level Up, Harness the Energy Transition at the University of Northampton. And we want to talk about how we ensure that the energy transition is fair and creates opportunities in the UK. Now, let me introduce another one of our giant panels to you. We have some really excellent panelists today. Let's start off with Councillor Karen Quinn. Karen is a councillor in Northumberland in the North East, and she's a particular interest in social mobility. She helped Justine Greening found the Social Mobility Pledge campaign. Professor Nick Petford is Vice Chancellor and Chief Executive of the University of Northampton, a geologist by training. He's worked in the oil industry and on academic and commercial research projects throughout the world. Guy Opperman is Conservative MP for Hexham, again, obviously in the northeast of England. He's been an MP since 2010, and he was appointed Minister for Pensions and Financial Inclusion in June 2017. Nigel Fenn is Head of People Projects and Planning for South West Water and Pennon, and this includes apprenticeships, graduates and Kickstart. He's also the chair of the South West Apprenticeship Ambassador Network. Professor Jeff Ollerton is visiting Professor of Biodiversity at the University of Northampton, and he's established himself as one of the world's leading experts on mutualistic ecological relationships. I have no idea what that means. He'll no doubt tell us over the course of the next hour. Randolph Brazier is Director of Innovation and there's this Electric Systems and the Energy Networks Association. Have I got that right, Randolph? I hope I have. Victoria Blake is the Environmental and Sustainability Manager at the University of Northampton, responsible for managing initiatives supporting the accomplishment of the goal to be net zero. So let's kick off with Karen, if we may. Karen, when we talk about levelling up and fairness in energy, what does that actually mean?
I think one of the reasons why we've set up the goals is that Justine has thought for a long time that when people talk about levelling up, there's no really clear consensus about what we're talking about. Is it north-south? Is it gender? Is it fame? I think we drew up the 14 levelling up goals to try and produce a simple architecture that would set out the 14 challenges that, if they were tackled, would help to level up the UK. And I think the energy transition is an interesting one. It sits alongside various goals on life stages, on recruitment, on health and well-being. But the energy transition goal is an interesting one in some areas that will obviously suffer because of the change into green energy and renewables, in areas in Scotland, for example. We have to look at how we can take positives out of that, upskill employees who will have to move from old technologies into new ones, and really look at how we can use green technology and renewables to level up the UK going forward.
And is this something you think that is on the political agenda at the moment, sort of the whole fairness in energy concept? Do government ministers really take a lot of notice of this?
I think that's really one for Guy to take on. Guy's been tireless.
Oh, don't worry, I'll come to him in a moment.
I think as we move forward with the pandemic, the levelling up agenda is going to become increasingly important, and it's going to be a time to stop just talking and to start acting. And yes, Guy has talked about renewable energy and pressurised pension schemes for quite some time to increase their investment in green energy and to help move the UK towards net zero. So I think, yes, definitely it is something that's going to be very important.
Well, Guy, let's come to you on this. What about the political imperatives here? Because energy provision, it's never one of the sort of sexy political issues, is it? I mean, nor I guess is your portfolio in pensions, but it's something that we're all going to really have to come to grips with over the next decade or so if we are to meet the government's ambitions and targets. But how can we do that in a fair way?
So I would refute the argument that this isn't a top of the political agenda, because I think it genuinely is. So first country in the G7 to legislate to get to net zero. We lead the way in ESG and environmental, social and governance matters. And with the Pension Schemes Act that we've just taken through Parliament, absolutely transforms climate change and pensions. So they are now hand in hand. So to get to the energy transition, you're going to need a lot of capital. So you're going to need redistribution of capital to support that energy change. And there is no doubt that the state is playing its part. You see what's happening in the Northeast with the backing for the gigavolt. In Blythe, you see what's happening in Teesside with the wind farm and the wind turbine production that's taking place. But also you need private capital supporting these organizations. And there are tremendous opportunities there. And I genuinely believe you will see a green industrial revolution supported by the state, powered by business and financed by capital, largely, which will be all of our pensions. And there is no doubt that this is top of the agenda. It really is.
And how do we compare with other countries in harnessing all of this?
We lead the way, without a shadow of a doubt. So genuinely, we lead the way on ESG. We're leading the way in which we are transforming the Northeast economy. I mean, I look at what's going on in Teesside, for example, under Mayor Ben Houchen, and you see that we're just creating 2 wind farms off the Humber and off the Teesside coast, which will create approximately 8 million houses renewable energy. That's partly private sector, but it's also with a £95 million support from the government. There is no doubt whatsoever that, certainly in my field, this is the key priority, and we're genuinely driving it forward. And I look at I'll give you a stat that will blow you away, that the person who runs the all-party group for hydrogen and ESG, 2 very techy but really important things, where they're based, they're not down south in metropolitan Islington, they're in Rother Valley. Now, there is a transformation of the traditional northern towns, the traditional northern economy, which will be driven by a green agenda, without a shadow of a doubt.
So I think this is fascinating, because I have to say, I would never have thought that pensions and this subject could be intrinsically linked, but from what you're saying, they clearly are.
They're 100% linked. That is both by government design. So if you look at the Pension Schemes Act, we have made investment in your pension has to take due account of climate change. We are the first government of the world to do this. Now, they do that for 2 reasons. The fundamental reason is that climate change will have an impact on your investment. So potentially, if you're not taking due account and you are investing in a particular stock or share that is going to be impacted by climate change, then you're going to lose money. But also, we're trying to harness the private sector capital to get behind the transition to net zero, which is going to affect us in so many ways, from our houses to our, obviously, cars, but also to the investment that is needed on an ongoing basis. And without a shadow of a doubt, that is what we're trying to do.
I will come to everybody else in just a minute, but I think this is quite fascinating. I think it really helps us lead off the entire discussion. The fact that I spend most of my time commentating on political issues, I present a radio program, I'm kind of almost ashamed that this is really the first time I've heard of this link. Are you finding it difficult to get this message out into the media, because people look at energy and pensions and think, that's not going to be very interesting for our audience, even though everybody's going to be affected by it?
So the answer is, it is not the traditional approach. So you're trying to make a new narrative, which is partly why we're discussing this today. And yes, I am engaging with, last Monday I was with Goldman Sachs. Today I was with the TUC. I'm speaking to all different audiences, making that case, and that it is not divestment is the way forward. It's about investment in the appropriate things to all get us to the net zero that we all want, but also to get you a decent return on a long-term basis. And there is a case to be made that this is a just transition, and that we can genuinely transform not only the economy, but also the environment of this country on a long-term basis. And I think it's a win-win. So there's a very quick point I'll make as well, which is we are first in the market. And anytime you are first in the market, you have a competitive advantage. So the fact that we're the first G7 to legislate for net zero, bring in what's called TCFD, which is climate change financial disclosure, is really important, because one of the benefits of Trump in the White House, and there weren't many, was that the likes of America and their financial capital were not engaged in environmental investing. They were not engaged in sustainable investing. They're not engaged in ESG. So City of London, our pension funds, our asset managers are first in the market. They have the expertise, and genuinely we can drive this forward.
Professor Nick Petford from the University of Northampton, I mean, you're kind of ahead of the game in this, and your background is in the energy sector. You must find this terribly exciting.
Well, I do, and just to support what Guy was saying, and this link between pensions and the environment, I think it's something which we should explore in much more detail. The whole notion of what we call ESG, which is the environment, sustainability, and governance. ESG guiding how we invest hundreds, millions, maybe even trillions of dollars around the world in people's pension funds, right? So the link is absolute and it's crystal clear to me. And if you get that link wrong, or you disinvest because that's the way you might be pushed by shareholders, that can have potentially negative effects that would ripple across anybody who's drawing a pension across the UK. So it's absolutely intrinsically linked. And I think, thanks, Guy, for raising that. I mean, in terms of how I guess oil companies are moving towards a climate change agenda. I'm not here as an apologist, by the way, for the hydrocarbons industry. I should make that perfectly clear. But when I was at BP in the early 2000s, Lord Brown was running the ship, and he, you might be rather tokenistic, but decided to rebrand BP as Beyond Petroleum. Why would you do that? Well, then 20 years ago, 2 decades ago, they realized that fossil fuels are a finite resource. These companies, they're energy companies. They're not hydrocarbon companies. So often people mix up the two. They will transition into a green technology, into a green economy. A lot of the work that we did in the exploration side, finding out how to get oil out of tiny holes and pores in the ground 2 or 3 miles down. All of that technology and that engineering can be reversed if you sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and re-inject it back into the ground. So that work, that technology hasn't been wasted by any stretch. And sometimes you get the impression that oil is just evil, it's ruined the world. Well, look, we've all ridden on the back of it, haven't we? Throughout the 20th century. Okay, there will be a transgression, and there has to be, because climate change is the probably most significant threat that humankind is facing right now. We all get that, but don't always beat up the big oil companies because they've helped us get to a place in life, in society, in terms of the standard of living, etc., which I think we all accept has made us better off than we were 100 years ago.
Do you think in some senses, and again, I'm not an apologist for them either, but do you think in some senses it's these big oil companies, the big energy companies, they actually hold the key to a lot of this, don't they?
I think they do through their technology. I mean, these are the big companies have got big reach, and as I say, it's important that there's I feel like a political pressure, if that's the right word, for them to allow them to transition to zero carbon quickly and effectively. But energy is the single biggest producer of greenhouse gases in the world. Is energy. It's what keeps us warm. It keeps the lights on. It allows your mobile phone to charge, and that demand is growing day by day with population, right? So we need energy, but at the same time, that's also the significant driver in climate change. So recognizing that tension, finding new ways that generate new forms of energy, generate new jobs, new growth, etc., is a really exciting opportunity. And I think the UK should be a leader in that space.
Thank you. Randolph Brazier from the Energy Networks Association. Do you, and I guess you represent all sorts of different energy sectors and industries. Do you think that there is a sort of universal sense of optimism and excitement across the range of the different energy sectors?
Well, thanks, Ian. So we represent the gas and electricity networks at both transmission, so at a national level, and also distribution at a local level. And we definitely feel that optimism. I couldn't agree more with Guy that the UK is leading. It's not just on technology either. It's our policies, it's our regulations, it's our systems. When we go and meet people in Europe or some of our members from other countries, they always come to us. They're looking to us for leadership on net zero. And that has filtered down to regulations. From a networks perspective, we're even creating new markets. So we're creating these new markets called local flexibility markets, which allow people to use their low carbon technologies at home, for example, electric vehicles, to actually support electricity grids and get paid for it. There's a lot of enthusiasm happening in the space. And I think the other thing that I would note is that young people are increasingly engaged and getting involved in these areas. They're really interested in renewables, in climate change, in supporting the environment. And going back to the pension point, that is filtering through to where they want to invest their money, and that's only increasing.
Nigel Fenn, you chair one of the energy and utility schools groups targeted with supporting the so-called next generation of employees in this sector. I mean, we've had a lot of optimism so far. I don't know if you're going to introduce possibly a note of skepticism here or not. I suspect not. But do you think that as sort of younger generations come through, there's going to be a different mindset to these issues, that sort of people of my sort of generation who may have come onto this a little bit late, younger people are growing up with it in a way that we didn't?
Yeah, I think, I think for a lot of people, they just want that opportunity, as Randolph was just saying, a lot of the people are quite passionate about some of these, these roles and to work in this space. So I think, the challenge is around, trying to be clear about what those roles look like, and it's trying to understand the sorts of jobs that we're recruiting for the next 5, 10, 15 years, so we can develop the qualifications, start building the experience. So as a country, we've got those sorts of skills to address those big problems and those big challenges that will be facing us, because it will take several years to get the sorts of numbers of people interested in roles, to get the qualifications, to build up the knowledge, and collectively then to address the challenges that will be faced in 5 or 10 years' time.
And Victoria Blake from the University of Northampton, do you think that there needs to be a bit of a PR job done on this, a marketing effort to ensure that everybody not only knows about it, but can buy into it? Because I think that there may be a sort of general tendency for people to look at sort of energy issues and climate change and just think of wind farms, and renewable energy is the solution, but it obviously goes far deeper and wider than that. What do you think about that?
That's a very good question, and communication and engagement is really key in my role, and I think anything that goes forward in relation to the energy transition. As you've highlighted, there are massive changes that can be made that directly impact our landscape, and visual changes to the energy provision. So you've talked about wind turbines and you've talked about PV panels, but there are also other innovations and changes that can happen that aren't necessarily something that you see and are very visible. So if you look at Waterside Campus, for example, we've done an awful lot around our new build and our construction. So you need to consider about how our energy performance has been, the low impact materials, where we have sourced this from, to how we've integrated new IT and business management services. So when any of us are using our buildings and utilizing these, we can pretty much go about our daily business without having to think too much about what it is that we're doing around conserving energy or saving energy. And at Waterside, we also have a great big district heat network, which is available and an opportunity that we can use to kind of branch out into local communities. Now, when we're talking about this to students, when we're talking about this to staff, it's kind of making sure that we can put that in a way that's understandable. So you might liken it to something else. So this is where you might find that somebody will say, we've saved 600 tons of carbon by using our biomass boiler, which is the equivalent to, running my car around the world 16 times. So it's very key that we've got to get the messages out in ways that are understandable, that they are always fresh and new, because these subjects and these topics, I don't think they're not new. We know that climate change has been around for a long time. We're aware of the climate emergency, and it's all about ensuring that we can maintain the right levels of engagement and getting the information out in a way that enables people to make good decisions and understand what it is that we've been doing.
Thank you very much. Professor Jeff Ollerton, I'm very keen to learn what mutualistic ecological relationships are and how they relate to the subject that we're talking about.
Well, the term win-win has been used several times, and that is what mutualisms are. They're win-win relationships. I guess the one you'll be most familiar with is the relationship between pollinators and the flowers that they pollinate. So bees or hummingbirds or moths gain a source of food, of nectar, and the plant gains seed reproduction. Another example you'll be familiar with are gut bacteria, of course. They get somewhere to live and something to eat, and they help to digest the food. Win-win relationships are really, really common across the natural world. And I'd really like to see some win-win relationships in relation to energy transition as well. well. And nobody, as you said, has sounded a note of skepticism yet. I'm going to sound a note of caution, I think. And the caution is this, you know, as Guy says, we're leading the world in energy transition, in investment in green technologies as well. But we're also leading the world in loss of biodiversity. We've probably lost more species and a greater proportion of our biodiversity than almost any other country on the planet. And the statistics are, for most groups of organisms, are not getting any better. You know, we've lost 97% of our species-rich grassland, for example, probably 90% of our wetlands as well. And I think sometimes what we forget is that there are really two emergencies going on at the moment. Yes, there's a climate emergency, and as Nick said, you know, it's really, really important that we get on top of this and that we fix it. But there's a parallel ecological emergency happening as well. And the causes and the effects of those two emergencies overlap. They're certainly not separate. But increasingly, we're finding examples where the priorities of the climate emergency seem to trump the priorities of the ecological emergency. So things like planting of plantation conifer trees on ecologically sensitive areas with a view to using them for biomass down the line, or inappropriate siting of solar farms and so on. I'm sure that there are some win-win situations out there, but we need to be very, very cautious about the decisions that we make at really a local planning level. And I think that's one of the ways in which universities can really play a role, is to actually do the research, do the background work to check what the ultimate effects are of certain decisions that are made.
Guy Uppelman, do you accept that note of caution there that Jeff has just articulated, that there can sometimes be conflicts? I mean, it sounds a bit weird for there to be sort of one part of an environmental policy to be conflicting with another, but I guess that it can happen.
So Ian, I represent rural Northumberland, and in Kielder Forest, which is a man-made forest after the First World War, we have the largest forest in the entirety of England. And it is a conifer forest. It provides hundreds and hundreds of jobs. And it is also, however, a biodiversity mecca, frankly. Now, there are downsides to conifers, but there are also massive pluses, whether it is red squirrels and ospreys and the like, and all manner of other things from pine martens downwards. So I think you can do, every government action, every investor's action has a consequence. Of course it does. And you pull one lever, there are sometimes secondary levers. But let me give you an example. In the rural way of life, if renewables is going to be the brave new world, then clearly there is great capacity for whether it is onshore or offshore wind. By and large, we're going for offshore, but it still isn't there. Clearly, there is capacity for tidal power. Clearly, there is capacity for mass solar. Now, I have massive 30 to 40 mile tracts of moorland. Do I want necessarily that to be mass solar? Well, that's a different matter. That's a question for planning. But clearly, at the moment, it is not very productive land in terms of sheep farming. So there are some who would say, well, there is a better use that you can use it, which produces you a climate change beneficial solution, produces energy on a long-term basis, provides jobs and prosperity for the local community who have been left behind. And whether you're in Northumberland or Norfolk or any other rural area, trying to find it working for the rural areas has got to be important as well.
Now, because I thought it was important that we get a lot of these issues out right at the start, I've let you all go on for quite a long time in your first answers, and we're nearly halfway through where we need to be. So if you could keep your answers a little shorter in the next section, that would be really helpful. Karen, let's come back to you. Jeff talked about the importance of universities here. What role do business and universities have in levelling up the energy transition?
I think there's a really, really desperate need for the two sides to speak to each other. I mean, Nick and Northampton have the Silverstone UTC, which is concentrating on the widening the skill, well, closing the skills gap. matching up the skills that are needed to these new industries that are coming through, and also the digital revolution. So I think it's very important that businesses are telling universities what skills they are going to be needing in the next 5-10 years, and universities are responding to that and making sure that the young people that they're educating have those skills and are able to go and thrive in those new industries.
Nick Petford, I guess you are a bit ahead of the game on this. How come you identified this issue as something that your university should maybe concentrate on?
Well, we had a great opportunity, Ian, a few years ago to relocate our two older campuses, one was built in the 70s, one was in the 1930s, which, you know, had kind of passed their sell-by date, certainly in terms of modern energy efficiency standards. So we built this brand new £350 million campus. You can see behind me on my visual screen, so I'm not actually at the university right now, I'm somewhere else, but the yellow tower there, that's our on-site biomass boiler. Now, Jeff Ollerton made a brilliant point there about biomass isn't always and using wood chipping for burning isn't always a silver bullet and all the rest of it. There's always compromises, but that site there, that's about 1 megawatts worth of energy that it provides the university as an energy island, and that heats about 80% of our estate. Now, an opportunity for the university would be to take that, to upgrade that building and then provide heat for the hospital just over the road, for example, or for other local businesses. So we can become an energy island, energy generator, with one clear eye to the fact that we need to use sustainable wood and materials in the biomass boiler. One example, I think the other way universities help massively, of course, is through research. You know, where do you think all these ideas come from? You know, mostly they come out of universities at all levels. And so I think more investment into into university research, into these key areas, I think would pay massive dividends.
And Randolph Brazier, this relationship between business and universities has always been a slightly fraught one, I think, in that it's sort of after you, sometimes in some other areas. How do you think that the relationship between business and universities in this area can be best utilised?
Yeah, I agree with you, Ian, and it definitely needs to improve. So National Grid, who's one of our members, they predict that we need 400,000 jobs in energy to deliver the net zero target, and 260,000 of those will be new roles, and 120,000 of those are required in the next decade. So that most of those are coming from STEM type areas. So we're going to have to work much, much closer with universities. One of the ways that we're doing it at the moment, which I think is a good model going forward, is partnerships. So we get access to a range of different funding mechanisms, innovation funding mechanisms, R&D funding mechanisms, where our members partner directly with universities on a wide range of different topics across the energy spectrum. So I think that model is probably something that we need to look at going further, because those sorts of models, when students are getting direct experience and interaction with industry at university, it inspires them. They get to see where the things that they're learning are actually applied. So yeah, I would fully advocate for a model like that going forward.
And Victoria, from your perspective at a university, do you see these relationships developing? What are you doing to enable that to progress?
And so we have built some fantastic partnerships with local businesses. So Nick's already talked about the hospital across the road. We're also part of a sustainability forum. So this is where we're highlighting what types of initiatives or skill sets and, you know, just like collaboration that we need to have to work together, so that not only can we achieve, you know, our targets around net zero, or how can we exchange knowledge, how can we support or work or develop research into, you know, like potential options that other companies have. I think a very strong point about universities and research is that we can give that kind of test bed area. We can develop like living labs, so we can understand and we can test different options and different approaches that either say companies or housing or local government, etc., can test these in a safe environment, see if they work, and understand how they can take those forward. So being at a university is a very exciting place to work at this, and we do actively work to develop partnerships and collaborate within Northampton Town and wider.
People always talk about government creating jobs, but it's obviously, particularly in this sector, I guess, it's business that needs the encouragement to expand and create jobs. But how can we get those jobs in the areas where they're most needed? I mean, Guy talked about a lot of this work being outside the rich South, but Nigel, do you have a view on that, and maybe how, I mean, as well as the university question, how it can be ensured that these jobs go where they're most needed?
Yeah, so I mean, across the whole sort of energy and utility sort of sector, each company individually have drawn up their own plans for what their strategies look like, and then we all come together collectively to align those plans to see where there's sort of, you know, overlap, so we can sort of pool our resources and our approaches. So it's clear we need to attract, you know, new, more young, talented people into our sector over the next 5, 10, 20 years to support those roles. You know, there are literally hundreds of thousands of new roles that are needed. You know, and in many companies, there's aging workforce that need replenishing as well as the new roles. So, you know, there is an overall view of that, you know, looking at it from each of the company's perspectives, and they've each got their own investment plans, and they're targeted all around the country. So, you know, it is a very joined up approach that's needed to address what is going to be, you know, a huge challenge across the whole country.
Jeff, you first mentioned universities, and everyone else has given their views on that subject. But does this need to go wider than just universities? Does the government need to maybe look at the curriculum in secondary schools to make sure that this next generation really are motivated to enter this kind of sector?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. I know there are plans afoot to launch a new GCSE in natural history, for example. And I think those sorts of approaches at a school level are absolutely vital. I think it's interesting that, you know, for universities, we've tried to embed environmental issues, if you like, across the curriculum, and to show how it links in with business, and show how it links in with engineering and art and design and so on. And it's only in recent years that that's really started to take off. That other parts of the university have really begun to get to grips with what it was that we're trying to say. And I find it very heartening. You know, I mean, the things that I was talking about 30 or 40 years ago and being dismissed as a hippie tree hugger, and now mainstream government policy, which is fantastic, you know. Well, I noted a word of caution earlier, but yeah, it's got to start at a young age, absolutely.
And Karen, let's just round off this part of the discussion with you. Do you think that the government can really try and direct jobs to different parts of the country, or, because I mean, most of these jobs are going to be in the private sector, it's quite difficult for government to intervene on that, isn't it?
It is. I mentioned before the government investment in the Humber and Teesside, bringing opportunity to those coastal communities. But in my own patch up here in Northumberland, British Volt are setting up a car electric battery plant, which is opening in 2023. It'll be the largest single industrial investment in the Northeast since Nissan, and has the potential to be really transformational. And it's coming here because there is affordable land, there are good rail links, there's an access to a deep water port, and there is also a great potential workforce. And interestingly, because they're not opening till 2023, they're reaching out to ex-offenders and to people who are lacking those core skills that they might need to train them up in the 2 years before the plant opens, so that they can apply for jobs there. So I think business needs to be bold. I think it needs to think afresh and take opportunity where it's needed the most. And I think it's going to be a job for government and business working side by side to bring that opportunity to these areas.
And Guy, just to follow up on that, what does the energy transition mean for the bits of the country that are often overlooked, or often appear to be overlooked by politics in general? Young people growing up in rural areas, for example, this is not just about areas with traditional high levels of unemployment in you don't get much more rural than your patch.
So I think there's 2 points to make. The first is, you can trace back the transformation of the Northeast economy back to Margaret Thatcher supporting Nissan, the wider impact that has, and then you look at the work that we did about 8 to 10 years ago after the 2010 general election, and you saw the campaign that we did for things like the enterprise zone in Blythe. It's no surprise, therefore, that wind farm production has followed that enterprise zone. You look at the UTC that we managed to get the money for in Newcastle. There's no surprise that the computer capabilities that are needed for electric vehicles, needed for all of the apprenticeships that we're working on, that they are now being manifested in the jobs that we see today. And so there is government can do stuff and has done stuff which we can then see manifesting itself in the form of jobs. I think you need to place your strengths, and that's what we've done in the Northeast, in Northumberland. I opened an apprenticeship factory literally 8 years ago, and the transformation of that local community in Hexham is massive. So I think there are opportunities here, and as Karen rightly put it, there is a reason why the Gigavolt factory, which is the biggest single investment pretty much in just transition that there is in the entire country, is happening in Northumberland, because it is a place that has been left behind. It is a place that is being leveled up, and it's where you can buy land a bit cheaper. It's where you've got a significant workforce, and you've got the capability of getting that workforce up to speed, ready to go to do mass production.
Do you think that the government's COVID recovery strategy is a threat or an opportunity to the energy transition, or is it a bit of both?
It's an opportunity, 100%. End of story.
Okay, well, let's see what other people think about that. Jeff, what do you think?
You're coming to me for the skeptical view, but I think in the long term, 20 years hence, we'll look back at the COVID situation. We'll see it for what it was, incredibly important at the time, but a temporary blip in what's happening. By that time, we know that climate change is playing out at the moment, and things will get worse in terms of extremes of weather and so on. And clearly, we've got to get down to net zero. So I don't think it'll make a huge amount of difference.
I'm not going to ask you all to be political about this, but Nigel, let me come to you next, because the Labour Party have said the government hasn't gone far enough in a sort of green revolution, as they call it. And yet we hear that in all sorts of different ways on carbon capture, on all sorts of different aspects of the climate change agenda, Britain is either world leading or it's in second or third place compared to most other industrial countries. But do you think the government have gone as far as they can go, or would you like to see a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more money, a little bit more innovation, a little bit more commitment?
I guess from, without it being a political answer, I guess from my perspective, anything that offers, incentives and encourages employers to take on more new young people, to give them the opportunity to take the plunge. It's been clear over the last year that young people have been impacted more in terms of, redundancies and furlough than some of their older colleagues. And also those from a BAME background have been disproportionately impacted as well. So I think anything that provides opportunities to help level up and to address that over the next coming years is absolutely welcome, certainly to provide those opportunities.
And do we think that Britain is in a good place from a investment point of view? Does the City of London, for example, recognise the opportunities here? Let me give you one example. We're told that because of Brexit, we have to have electronic vehicle battery manufacturers in this country. We won't be able to import them, these batteries, in the same way that we have done in the past from Europe. Now, there's clearly a massive opportunity there for someone to say, okay, well, let's start up a factory. I've got no idea how much money that would take, but has our manufacturing sector been hollowed out to such an extent over the past few decades that maybe we can't take advantage of this? Nick?
Whoa, that's unexpected turn. Well, manufacturing, I'm going to take you in a very different direction. I'm going to talk about fashion footwear.
Okay.
I'm going to say it because manufacturing, there's a myth that Britain doesn't make things, which is nonsense, right? So the local economy around Northamptonshire, maybe 12% of that is manufacturing based. We've got Dr. Martens here, we've got massive fashion footwear industry. That's English workers in producing goods which are sold at a premium in Beijing and all the rest of it. So why can't we're still doing it. We just need to find another way of taking our intellectual capital driven out of universities, working with businesses to get an exciting, dynamic green economy growing in the same way that we already have older style manufacturing capability already in place. So I think there's exciting opportunities here, and we shouldn't write off Britain as a country that only does services. There's still manufacturing here, and I'm very proud of what we do in Northamptonshire in that respect.
Guy,
Ian,
I think I saw you nearly erupt to that question, so you have a go.
Yeah, well, so Ian, the answer to your question is that if you want battery manufacture and you want the UK to do it in a post-Brexit world, you go to Blythe and you look at the 3,000 jobs that have been created by the Gigavolt factory. Now that will be up to stream by 2023. It's an exact example of a post-Brexit solution to a supply chain problem, which is also creating a significant number of jobs in an area which has the highest form of unemployment in the entire country, more than Northern Ireland, Scotland or Wales, which is the Northeast. Now, and it's government backed, but it's private sector led. Now, that's the classic partnership, no different from what Margaret Thatcher did with Nissan 30 odd years ago.
Do you feel confident, though, that we have the business leaders to bring this about?
Yes, I mean, let me give you an example. So BP is led by Bernard Looney, who is an Irishman who is transforming a traditional petrochemical company into a clean energy company, which is a massive shift. And you see the way in which these very large companies are changing the way in which they're doing business. And provided we support them, we don't go down the divestment path, we can do this for sure.
Victoria Blake, I mean, some of these subjects are slightly outside the area that you cover in your day-to-day work, but do you subscribe to this sense of optimism that we've been hearing, that we are actually in a really good position to take advantage of the opportunities here?
Yes, I absolutely do believe that we are in a position to do that. So my background before I started at university was in construction and the built environment, and a lot of headway and progress has been made around not just the green transition and net zero, but across a number of areas of sustainability. We've talked about biodiversity, we look at, like water, there's waste, there's other resources, there's carbon emissions that are beyond just transport. So we've got our scope 3 emissions that we have to look at. And I think over the years, business leaders have understood or are definitely beginning to understand that sustainability makes business sense. It affects your bottom line. You need to consider things about your policies. And I think whenever you're looking at producing a product or a service, how you've dealt with and look at the sustainability of that is a very key point to your business and what it is that you're doing going forward.
And
Randolph, so I absolutely do believe.
Great. Randolph, do you see this in your sector, in gas and electricity, that the younger business leaders in particular really subscribe to this agenda, which maybe if we were having this discussion 10 years ago, there might have been some resistance to?
Definitely, it's really popular, and the UK is a really good place to invest. I mean, just at the moment, as part of our green recovery scheme within the electricity sector, we're investing circa 300 million in the networks to support green recovery projects to get connected quickly over the next 1 to 2 years. And I also tend to agree with Nick that there is a myth about us not manufacturing. We might not do the individual nuts and bolts, but our systems engineering for producing quality systems that cover multiple sectors, it's world leading. So I think it's a bit of a myth. It's just maybe we don't produce the individual nuts and bolts so much.
Well, I completely agree with you. People don't seem to realise we are still the 9th biggest manufacturing nation in the world. And on my radio show every Thursday, we have somebody coming on to tell us all about the good news in the manufacturing sector, because everyone always concentrates on the bad news, which I think is quite a good thing to do. As we start to wind up, let's look at how we can measure success here. Both from a point of view of levelling up the energy transition, but also in terms of jobs. So how can we measure whether this new energy transition has been successful, say in 5 or 10 years time, I don't know what a reasonable period would be, how can we measure that success? And both in business terms and political terms. Nigel, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I think all the utility companies in the whole sector have to produce business plans that are all thoroughly tested by all their stakeholders and signed off by their regulators. So a simple key measure is about delivering against those plans and those promises. So and in there it lists the types of jobs, the amount of investment, and the specific outputs that are going to be delivered. So for the sector, once they've committed to making that investment, it's very measurable.
Jeff.
I would like to see more measurements, or improvement in more measurements around environmental indicators that are more than just related to net zero. So things like water pollution, things like the amount of plastic that's being dumped into our rivers and oceans, loss of biodiversity. I've already mentioned some of the statistics for some of our groups of organisms. They're going down and down and down and down. I'd like to see some of those turned around.
Is that possible to do? Can you turn around? I mean, from the figures that you gave earlier, I mean, I was actually quite shocked by what you said. I didn't know that. I'm slightly ashamed that I didn't know that. But why isn't that getting as much coverage?
It is. It's just you're not looking at the places where it's getting the coverage. Organisations like the RSPB, the wildlife trusts, and so on have been talking about this for a very, very long time.
Yeah, but they can talk about it. But if they're not, if people like me, who host 3-hour radio shows every night, aren't talking about it and aren't bringing that message to the general population, fine, people can talk within themselves, but what effect does that have?
But organisations like the RSPB and the Wildlife Trust are very large membership organisations, and so the word is getting out through those. Okay. I think what it needs is strengthening of laws around environmental protection. And also enforcement as well. We know that organisations like Natural England and the Environment Agency have had massive budget cuts and have lost many members of staff over the last decade, and that needs to be reversed as well.
Victoria.
I think both Nigel and Jeff have rounded it out quite nicely. It's about whatever plans or commitments that we put in place, that we look at delivering on those, and that we put in, measurable KPIs and targets to meet those, and that there needs to be some flexibility, to account for any new technologies, any new changes. So we shouldn't be rigid in what we set.
Karen, let's come to you for your concluding words. How do you think we can measure success?
It's not my area of expertise, but we do a lot of talking about measurement around the levelling up goals, and the University of York are working with us at the moment on putting sub goals under the 14 and then providing metrics to see how we can actually measure. And what I would say is that we need to move into a way where we're actually measuring real impact, not just figures, not just money spent, but actual impact on life chances and on opportunity. And I'm nowhere near clever enough to sort those measurements out, but I think that's the way we need to go, and hopefully that's what we will come up with as a result of this work with York.
Randolph.
So I think ultimately we need to measure the pillars of the energy trilemma. So we need to make sure that we're achieving net zero carbon, which is measurable. We need to make sure that we're doing it in an economic way and that we have protection there for vulnerable customers. And we also need to continue to measure and maintain our world-leading levels of energy security and resilience in the electricity and gas grids.
And what encouragement do you think that business needs to ensure that these goals are actually met?
I think we need to sort of maintain a regulatory system that supports investment in these new and clean energy systems. And it also needs to be agile. There's still quite a lot of uncertainty out there. So whatever the policies and regulations are that we come up with to achieve net zero, they need to be agile so that we can move and adapt quickly and that investors can get ready to go as soon as there's enough evidence to justify investing in certain areas.
And Nick, if we were sitting here in 5 years' time, recounting, or maybe playing all of this back and thinking, okay, well, we were quite prescient in that, but maybe we missed a trick here. What do you think we might be saying in 5 years' time? Do you think that everybody would still be as optimistic, obviously with the exception of Jeff, as we have been today?
Well, look, we live in a world with what, 9 billion people plus, and it's growing every day. So the big tension moving forward will be, what trade-offs are we prepared to make? We can all sit here and be clever now about the here and now. One of the great things about being a geologist, actually, is you understand in 4.5 billion years of Earth history, there have been major catastrophes where the climate's changed beyond recognition. It's just that we weren't around to witness it. So we are now, and we are pretty much responsible for what's happening. But take one example of something we talked about earlier, which is lithium in car batteries. Like, that's great. It seems like a green technology. Where does the lithium come from? Well, it comes out of the ground, right? You've got to dig it out and you've got to mine it. That's environmentally destructive. So there's no get out of jail card free in this, guys. You know, there's no free lunch. And I think as we move forward, when we move forward with 1 foot, it's important we don't just have 1 foot forward, 1 foot back. So understand what the trade-offs are, have rational decisions about them in advance, so we realize that we will be making some degradation to the planet Earth in terms of what we need to do in terms of energy development. But we understand that before we make that transition, and we mitigate it elsewhere.
So Guy, I've deliberately left you until last. In terms from a political point of view, from a governmental point of view, how are you going to measure success on this?
Well, I think there are various ways you could put it, but you could say that you would turn the red wall blue to green eventually. And you do that through a green industrial revolution. Just like the Victorians transformed the north of England by the Industrial Revolution and totally powered it up in terms of investment and civic infrastructure and so much more. And let's be blunt, significant wealth of jobs. I believe very strongly that there is the capacity to do this now. Now, that will require significant investment. I think I can help there. There requires new jobs, new skills, and it requires the opportunity to exist by a country that is first in market, which the UK is. And then you look at our ability going forward and what 5 years' time looks like. I will refute Jeff's negativity by pointing out that the Environment Bill is the single most successful Environment Bill that's ever been passed, and passed on a cross-party basis. But I park that for a second. We would then be an exporter of energy, of skills, of electric vehicles from Sunderland. There is a tremendous opportunity for this country, not just to be self-sufficient in its way forward, but actually to be an exporter of the expertise that we have developed and the manufactured goods that we develop. It is a huge opportunity on so many levels.
Is this something that you would like to maintain an interest? I mean, obviously, government ministers come and go, reshuffles happen. But one of the things in certainly some of the departments I'm more interested in, transport being for one, there's a different Secretary of State for Transport every year almost, or it seems like that anyway. Doesn't there need to be a bit of consistency here in political oversight? So
I'm on my 5th Secretary of State. I've done this job for 3.5 years, and I've got through 5 Secretaries of State, all of whom are esteemed and worthy colleagues. Some were better than others. But
no names.
No, I couldn't possibly. But yes, there's no doubt that certain things, pensions is a good example, tax is another example of government policy, you are very unwise to change on a regular basis. So I asked to do this job. Because I could see the great capacity. Bear in mind, I have the biggest budget of any single minister in government, and I believe I have the biggest capability of making the difference than any other minister in government. I'm making 30 to 40-year decisions, investing all of our pensions in, I believe, a very just transition way, for a very good way, which ultimately will lead to levelling up of this great country.
I think that's the ultimate humble brag there. Very good way to end. Listen, I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I've learned an awful lot. And I think if the general public can get this sort of sense of infectious enthusiasm that people have displayed in this conversation, I think everyone will buy into it. So it goes back to one of the points that I think we made earlier, that Victoria made, that there needs to be a bit of a PR and marketing effort in actually enabling people to understand why this should happen, what the ramifications are and all the positive benefits that come out of it. So thank you all very much indeed. Let's give you all a name check again at the end. Councillor Karen Quinn, Professor Nick Petford, Guy Opperman, Nigel Fenn, Professor Jeff Ollerton, Victoria Blake and Randolph Brazier. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much, and I hope you'll all join us again next time for our next webinar.